Napoleon truly was on top of the world, with an entire continent subjugated to his will. He had truly walked in the paths of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He had risen from the ranks of a son of an inconsequential family to the overlord of an entire continent. He had conquered all of his foes, but despite it all, Napoleon was mortal. For all of his strength, power, and cunning, Napoleon could not conquer death. It's 1820. And Napoleon is stuck with an impossible decision to make. His son, Napoleon II, is only 9 years old. If he were to die now, his empire would be in the hands of an adolescent, and would surely fall apart as the bickering factions of the empire manipulate his son into obsolescence. Napoleon considered offering the throne to his brother, who would have had much more experience governing than a child. However, any sort of promising the throne to one other than his son would cause a succession crisis and may destroy the empire that he tirelessly endeavored to build. Either option was equally terrifying to Napoleon, and all the while, he had to administer an empire which encompassed the entirety of Europe, all with different cultures and languages. Would Napoleon last long enough for his son to inherit? Will his empire of Europe hold? What has been happening in the rest of the world? Welcome to the Epilogue of Project Bourbon, where we explore the ramifications of this alternate world. If you're watching this as part of the movie, I hope you've enjoyed so far. If you've clicked into this video, this is a multi-episode alternate history. You can watch it all as one movie, which will be inside the playlist, or you can watch them episodically. The choice is yours. Without further ado, let's explore the ramifications of this world. With a point of divergence so far back in time, it's hard to seriously comprehend exactly what would have been happening in the Indian subcontinent. The British East India Company would potentially not be able to conquer Bengal like they had in our timeline, due to the fact that they were allies of France. However, the more things change, the more they stay the same. After the Bourbon Empire was exiled, and the British slowly cannibalized their empire, Britain would gain the possessions that they had sought anyway. Britain would hold on to India, but once Britain fell to the Napoleonic invasion, the territories of India were restructured. Formerly French outposts and protectorates would be governed by France, and the British East India Company would continue to be administered by Britain, splitting the realm apart, but still controlled directly or indirectly by the European crown. This division of the colonial efforts of the Europeans in the subcontinent would give the Maratha Empire time to consolidate itself and prepare for any sort of invasion against their rule. The Marathas were highly divided at this point of history, with many historians referring to the Marathan Empire as the Marathan Confederacy. While the European administration may be as fractured as the Marathans, the European modernized armies could quickly subjugate India if given the opportunity. But due to the immense administrative strain, colonial efforts were put on hold until Europe stabilizes. A similar situation would be present in Indonesia, with the Dutch East India Company incorporating all other European holdings into its domain. The Dutch East Indian administration would be united, unlike the Indian companies, but would not be able to expand without European military aid, so they would await their opportunity to expand. Despite the long point of divergence, the history of China would not have been much different than our history. This is due to the Qing Empire's insistence on isolation with the rest of the world. Macau being in European hegemony would allow for Chinese goods to be accessible by the entire continental empire. But other than that, things would remain mostly the same. Due to the decline of Russia, the subjugation of the British Empire, and the acquisition of lands in Iran, the Safavid dynasty of Iran would be extremely well off. Europe would see Iran as a major ally against Russia, and would support their wishes to expand in order to strengthen them, rather than keeping them from expanding in order to prevent a European war, just like our history. The possibility of Iran fully uniting under the Safavids is incredibly possible, leaving the potential of an industrialized Iranian power to rival the Egyptians. Egypt would have been doing very well in this alternate history. Muhammad Ali had managed to modernize Egypt, conquer the Sudan, and was close to claiming the entirety of the Sublime Porte for himself. However, Napoleon would fear the ascension of the Egyptians, and would therefore enforce that Egypt cease hostilities with the Ottomans, lest the balance of power be disrupted. Egypt would settle with annexing only the Levantine Ottoman land, and establish a Kurdish buffer state. But there was now a clear conflict between the Egyptians and the Europeans. Napoleon would entrench the puppet state status of the Ottomans as more and more treaties are signed, giving the Christians of the Balkans independence and fealty to the European Empire. Despite Europe's continued expansion, the Egyptian state was beginning to rise to great power status, as more and more Arabian lords would align with Egypt, seeking a pan-Arab state. There were still some vestiges of European influence in the Arabian region, however, as the Bani Khalid Emirate had sworn fealty to the British during the Napoleonic Wars in this alternate history. Now, due to the unification of Europe, the Emirate was a protectorate of the Europeans. This protectorate was incredibly vital for European presence in the Indian Ocean and the continued support of their Iranian ally, who was a major point of resistance against any pan-Arabic ambitions of Muhammad Ali. Further to the sudden Egyptian-European Cold War, the French-influenced states in North Africa had become protectorates. Napoleon had sought to end Barbary piracy in order to ensure the safety of trade from Europe and the rest of the world. Now, with the sudden flaring of tensions with Egypt, further military presence in Africa was required, leading to several European forts being established in the region. The rest of Africa would remain mostly the same, with two major exceptions. First being the return of the Cape to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the entirety of Western Africa being turned into a trading company. Cape Town being under British hands for a while would have affected the demographic there, but it was supposed to be a Dutch colony. With the Napoleonic seizure and return to the Netherlands, the Boers were able to maintain their presence in the Cape, expanding into the veldt. The striking of diamonds would lead to a diamond rush, as Europeans of all kinds would venture into South Africa to gain riches. The unification of Europe had caused all these Western African colonies of Europe to fall under the leadership of Napoleon. Therefore, they would be incorporated into a new company, the European West Africa Company, in order to facilitate trade with Western Africa and the rest of Europe. This, of course, would include slaves, who were imported to European colonies in America, where slavery was made legal by Napoleon. With the collapse of Britain, Napoleon had reconquered Hispaniola, and following Napoleon's historical re-legalization of slavery, would re-enslave the populations there. Due to Napoleon's influence in Portugal, Brazil was an integral part of the Empire of Europe. The potential for a second American campaign was always looming over the nations of South America. Chile had managed to somehow become the major power in the Southern Cone, being the only nation there to survive Napoleon's conquest. Their national awakening had infused them with a deep sense of militarism, claiming all the land to the Chilean captaincy. Some Chileans had even advocated for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in order to legitimize their claim to the captaincy and potentially lead to the rise of a new Bourbon Empire. For now, the native states of Aymara, Quechua, and Paraguay have remained untouched by Chile, New Spain, or Napoleon as convenient buffer states between each other. The Bourbon Empire moved to Mexico to stage a government in exile. They had time after time had their empire slowly reduced until they were delegated to the Caribbean. The legacy of their exile has led to the consolidation of all their American mainland territories into a new state, the Kingdom of New Spain. New Spain had managed to expand beyond even the borders of the Bourbons, as the formerly co-administered region of Colombia was seized fully by the New Spanish following the collapse of the British Empire. With this seizure, New Spain had become the largest power in America, and with legitimate claims against all their neighbors. But despite it all, they were still considered a kingdom. This simply would not do. Louis Philippe would be crowned Emperor of America by the Mexican Pope, claiming all the lands granted to them by the Pope after the treaties of Tordesillas and Saragossa. The rise of this new empire had given them the stability and legitimacy they needed to develop their economy and begin attempts to reclaim their empire. The United States of America has now fully entrenched themselves with the institution of slavery. With the annexation of several Caribbean islands, the locals were enslaved by southern plantation owners and settled heavily in order to incorporate these territories into proper slave states. After the New England secession, the United States had guaranteed the institution of slavery in the Constitution. After the reconquest of New England, this amendment had not changed. Thus, America would begin to import more slaves from the European West African Company, with the aim to further militarize and reconquer their lost territories. After the failure of the American invasion of New Spain, the militia-based army of the United States had been abolished in favor of a standing federal army. In this timeline, The desire for a strong army would be vital for the Americans to continue the existence of their state, so a strong military class would cement themselves into American society. The American Athens has been slowly transformed into the American Sparta. Despite the constant territorial losses of the United States, their demographics were the strongest in North America. However, with the stabilization of the American Empire, the potential for the United States to be eclipsed by the empire was a serious threat. Therefore, the state would be seeking to strike the empire when the time was right. With the seizure of British territories in North America, Canada had now been united under a francophone majority. While the American Empire still had desires to claim their land, Canada and the American Empire both would fear the United States of America more, putting the potential Canadian-American Empire conflict on the sidelines for the time being. Due to Canadian ascendancy, they were able to incorporate the Métis into their state, as the Native Confederacy had shunned the Métis due to their heritage. The expansion of Canada would alarm the Empire of America, but feared the consequence of weakening Canada, as the militarized United States would surely pounce on any opportunity to conquer them. And all the while, between these three states was the Native Confederacy. Their previous benefactor of Britain had suddenly been subsumed in its entirety, and they would fear invasion from any of these three powers in the event of a great North American war. The continued existence of a Native American state was heavily dependent on fluid diplomacy, as they swore allegiance to all three of the states privately, and in the event of war between the three states, the Native Confederacy would be prepared to invade the obvious loser in order to ensure their continued existence. Napoleon's Europe was prosperous, but significant socio-economic deficiencies had caused the Republicans and others in his domain to migrate to America. The Spanish have mostly migrated to Chile and the Empire of America. The French have migrated to Canada, and the German and Anglo-Saxon Protestants would move into the United States of America, strengthening these states and weakening Europe. Despite Napoleon's best efforts to ensure the prosperity of his realm, they were significantly overextended, and with no sign of stabilization in sight. Napoleon had feared that his empire would suffer the fate of Alexander the Great, divided among his marshals until they bled each other dry, and their subjects gained independence. The stress would be too much for the ailing Napoleon, and on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon would die of stomach cancer. It had been only a couple of years of peace under Napoleon's new European order, and now it had all been passed down to his son, Napoleon II. At barely 10 years old, the eaglet is now the overlord of all of Western Europe. Shortly after Napoleon's death, Napoleon's brother, Joseph, claimed that Napoleon had promised the empire to him, citing his son's unpreparedness. This succession crisis manifested into an armed struggle. Eventually, Napoleon II would vacate to Portugal, and following a Republican revolution, was subsequently exiled to Brazil, where his loyalists would station themselves, plotting a reconquest. The irony of exile to America was not lost on the American Empire, and began diplomacy with Brazil, yet to determine whether they would support the eaglet or expel Napoleonic forces from America with force. With news of an armed struggle in Europe, the numerous anti-Napoleonic organizations would revolt. In an early springtime of nations, the Portuguese Republican Revolution would proclaim the Second Iberian Republic, and Bourbon loyalists would revolt in Spain, seeking to break free from Napoleonic hegemony. Britain would be overtaken by Chartists, who revolted against the Napoleonic Kingdom of Britain. Joseph Bonaparte would offer the former kings of Britain and Hanover the throne in exchange for their loyalty, leading to a Republican monarchical civil war in Britain. The Germans would be inspired by this event, with several nationalist revolts erupting in the region. The high-influence states bordering the European Empire break free. Russia would invade Poland, seeking to reconquer their territories. This Russia would be far more successful and modern compared to our timeline, as the Decembrists had succeeded in their revolution. This republic had endeared the former Russian territories to their side, with the potential of a resurgent Russia extremely likely. Whether Russia would remain a republic or transform back to an empire, like what had happened to France, would be up to the Russian people and their desire for liberty. Denmark-Norway would sign an agreement with Russia and would begin their ambitions to unite Scandinavia as they invade Sweden, and Russia marches to reclaim St. Petersburg. Italy begins to shatter back into small states, with the most successful independence revolt being the Republic of Sicily. Hungary and Dacia begin fighting, and the Slavic territories of Greater Hungary begin their struggle for independence. The European protectorates of North Africa begin shattering as local insurrections begin pushing back Europeans to their fortifications. Seeing their weakness, Egypt marches into the Bani Khalid Protectorate and seeks to incorporate Tripolitania into their state, allowing them to link up with the North African rebellions. The Marathan Empire begins wars of reconquest against the European outposts in the subcontinent, seeking to unify India under their control. And last but not least, Australia starts a Republican revolution. Napoleon's legacy shatters with his death. The Republican-turned monarch now suffered the downsides of the monarchical institution as the succession crisis threatens to destroy his empire. His brother rules France with an iron fist and begins to attempt to reform the European empire into more of an institution rather than an empire itself. These efforts seem in vain, however, as a seventh coalition of Republicans begins to shatter the hegemony that they had enjoyed. Another member of this seventh coalition would be Napoleon II, the eaglet, who has been exiled to Brazil. This Napoleonic Brazil would incorporate the La Platan autonomy directly into their domain as they began preparations of war between themselves and Greater Chile. Further to their nationalist ambition, Chile began preparing a total conquest of the southern cone of South America. Would Napoleon II, the eaglet, return home? Or would he forge a new empire of his own in South America? Will the dream of a united Europe survive? Or would the idea fade away once the separatist rebels succeed? Will the Empire of America work with or against Brazil? Would the United States of America, with their militarist focus, be able to achieve their manifest destiny? Or would their embracement of the institution of slavery lead to another civil war? Would this civil war be of freedom and slavery? Or would it be a war of emancipation of the enslaved? These questions are truly impossible for me to predict. However, this scenario is too interesting not to continue in some way. So, I've decided to open it up to you, my community, for another nation roleplay. That's right, Project Bourbon NRP, Napoleon's Legacy, is now live for you to play. Join the Discord, link in the description to register your nation or join as a moderator. Shout out to Enzo, Rafael Souza Silva, Louis Avant, Grud, Kaiser Gaming, and Jubs for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Thanks again to my community for your help with flags and lore suggestions. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do with this scenario. I hope we all have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Please subscribe. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye.